Young lady, what are you doing? Oh, hi, Cheshire Cat. I'm trying to decolonize my thinking. Are you? Do tell me about colonization. Well, how do I begin? Have you ever seen Pocahontas? That's a Disney movie, my dear. But Cheshire Cat, you're a Disney character. First of all, madam, Cheshire Cat was a literary character before being Disneyfied. And secondly, he is one of my many forms, only some of which are Disney. I am the Trickster. I appear in many stories, challenging the hero. Sometimes I am the hero. Sometimes I am an antagonist. Sometimes an anti-hero. Sometimes a mentor. I am in that Pocahontas movie of yours as Grandmother Willow. I am also Rafiki from The Lion King. Yoda I am, too. Dumbledore and Feeny. But those are just some modern examples of trickster mentors. I am also a trickster hero in many different mythologies. For example, Loki from Norse mythology, Hermes from Greek mythology, Anansi the spider from African folklore, Brer Rabbit from African American folklore, and the crow or raven from Native American folklore. I appear in many places, many stories from around the world where different writers interpret me many different ways. And do you take issue with how Disney portrays you? Oh, I love a good Disney film in its proper place. And what place is that? As entertainment, as a teacher of certain moral lessons, as a new way of telling old tales, not as an introduction to history. But, history is mature and R-rated. Pocahontas is a kid-friendly way to get them used to the topic of colonization, but at the expense of accuracy.
Filmmakers originally envisioned a more, shall we say, historically rooted film, but the studio head Jeffrey Katzenberg pushed it to what he considered to be more commercial. Pocahontas was originally closer in age to the historical Pocahontas. It was even kicked around for a while that the Powhatan characters, yes, would speak entirely in native Powhatan, and Pocahontas would have to go through the process of learning English. And most of the decisions that dragged the movie down into mediocrity were born out of Katzenberg's desire to force a Best Picture contender like Beauty and the Beast. Pocahontas was aged up, and it was turned into a Romeo and Juliet-inspired love story, with the language barrier being transversed via listening with one's heart.
All of the history of colonialism and genocide down to one evil bad guy. Not to mention that they also do the not all whites thing. And again, of course, they both sides the whole conflict. Pocahontas was just a movie made to make white people feel good about themselves, and that's about it. And I'm glad that we moved on in these past 25 years.
Hangover I get from Pocahontas is how it reinforces this comfortable lie that white Americans are fed from birth. That things were a little tense at first, but ultimately the whites and the natives got along and everything was fine. Like seriously, the movie both sides is the whole issue. Yeah, the English had guns and smallpox and decades of driving the natives off their lands, but the Powhatans jerks too, you guys.
Well, the movie's not supposed to be based on real history. Look what it says on the Disney Plus page. It says it's based on the legend and folklore of Pocahontas mixed with history. It's not a historical historical documentary, it's historical fiction. It should be presented as historical fiction. Exactly my point! Well, if I used it in an educational setting, I would use a disclaimer that it's fiction and not real history. If it needs heavy disclaimers in an educational setting, then is it really an educational tool? Huh? Well, I think stories are a good way to learn. Most cultures, including indigenous people, view stories for millennia to teach lessons. Yes, but which stories? Some stories are more appropriate to a situation than others.
Scholars and activists from all over the Pacific to help with accuracy and sensitivity issues. But as Tina Ngata points out, having brown advisors doesn't make it a brown story. It's still very much a white person's story. No matter how much the story draws from the culture it's trying to portray, at the end of the day, it's still a very narrow Disney coming-of-age story. The legacy of colonialism is baked into every facet of every culture on the planet. Colonialism has had an incalculable impact on human civilization. That is why it's so difficult to parse out exactly the impact of Group A being portrayed by dominant cultural Group B in Disney movies.
As Lindsay says, although Disney has made improvements since Pocahontas, for example in Moana, it is still heavily filtered through a colonial lens. I enjoy Disney's Pocahontas as a piece of entertaining historical fiction and a parable about peace. It is simplified. It shows peace being achieved in a much simpler way than in reality. It is not an educational tool for learning about colonialism. Something I think Disney could do that would be a nice gesture would be to have maybe as a bonus feature on the Disney Plus page for Pocahontas some resources pointing people to the real story of Pocahontas. Cheyenne Lynn provides an example of a work of literature that does something to this effect.
Remarked that they love using Kaya and her books as educational tools because at the end of every book there's a history and context section which delves into the real history that the fictional book presents.
Although she also provides reasons the American Girl dolls were still somewhat problematic, it is nice that the American Girl books had a factual section separating fact from fiction and pointing people towards more factual resources. It's so hard to find accurate representations of indigenous people in mainstream pop culture. It's filled with wildly inaccurate and sometimes downright offensive representation. For example, I've been watching Star Trek Voyager, which was made in the 90s, and it has an indigenous character, but the way they portray him is pretty inaccurate and offensive. There is one episode of Voyager where Chakotay finds out that his tribe were originally these sort of backwards people with no culture until aliens came and changed that. Ah, yes, I remember traveling through the Star Trek universe well. It was kind of a headache. It's too bad what you call mainstream pop culture is the only place you can look for stories of indigenous people. If only there were some way to find stories of indigenous peoples told by them. Well, there is a channel called APTN, and Apple TV has a whole section called Indigenous Voices, some of it also educational. I guess when the thing we're looking for isn't in our face all the time, we need to look for it. Careful where you step, though! What's wrong? How certain are you that these stories are told by indigenous people? Well, there is a show I've been watching called Trickster, which I looked up and learned that it was cancelled because of a controversy in which the creator wasn't really indigenous, and Apple TV still has it listed under indigenous voices. That's a little disappointing. Oddly appropriate it happened with a show called Trickster, though. Indeed, but most of the shows here seem legit. It's just this tells me I need to make sure to do my research. 1491 is a documentary series that covers various aspects of life in North and South America before colonization. And it is very enlightening and informative. Of course, the topics are far too broad to cover in 8 hours, but one of the best things about it is it inspired me to want to research some of the topics further. I think it is a valuable thing when pop culture, fiction or non-fiction, inspires further research. Many TV shows I watch, for instance New Amsterdam, bring up a lot of social issues for the audience to think about, but they usually use fictionalized aspects and a bit of hyperbole to make the point. The APTN police drama Tribal depicts an indigenous woman who is a police officer and deals with the racism from her partner on the force.
You're a face and an ass and an Indian.
Do you not believe that they have to deal with racism like that from their colleagues in real life? Oh, I'm sure they do, but I imagine it's usually a lot subtler and harder to prove than in the show. So how do you know to what extent shows are using hyperbole? Well, you have to do some research beyond the show. Even an educational show like The Magic School Bus, which teaches about science, mixes in fictional elements. That's why each episode has a segment where it separates the fact from fiction. No, the planets are not lined up in a convenient row like that. Fictional narratives have their place in education. They help the learners form an emotional connection to the material, but afterwards you need to make sure to separate the fact from the fiction. Disney is getting better with incorporating voices from the cultures they represent. Their latest animated film, for instance, Raya and the Last Dragon, set in a fantasy world based on Southeast Asia, included creators from Southeast Asia in the writing and production. Some recent Pixar short films such as Sanye's Super Team and Bao are created by people from the cultures they portray. Though these Disney films are still somewhat filtered through a colonial lens, at least they are less so than some of Disney's previous works. Now, I won't fault Disney or other entertainment companies for trying to make money and entertain. Those are their main jobs. Education is not their main job. But since they have such a great wide influence on people, if they can include voices from other cultures and give them a chance to tell their stories, that's a good thing. The closer the mainstream media gets to reflecting the world's diversity in accurate and inclusive ways, the less colonized the consumer's mind will be. Well, we can talk about pop culture all day, But we're here for another reason as well, the subject of your degree. Oh yes, education, and how the story that mainstream education has told for the most part has also been through a colonial filter. We've basically been taught about the history of North America like it's an extension of Europe. We learnt the story of Europeans discovering North America, even though there were people already here, and there was nothing for Europeans to discover. We were told the story with Europe as the main character, and everything was related to how it was significant to Europe. And I'll just let Cheyenne Lynn tell you all about the lies of Thanksgiving.
During Thanksgiving, we pat ourselves on the back and say that the day isn't about a falsified history given to us 200 years after the actual first Thanksgiving in paintings and statues done by white people, but rather about family and sports and parades and consumerism, and it is all that. But it's also about the land we forcibly took and the 12 to 15 million people we murdered to get here.
Other than TV and film, what are some educational resources that tell the stories that need to be told? The Kairos blanket exercise is done throughout Canada and is an interactive history lesson where the group leaders take the group through the story of some of the important historical events in the history of Indigenous people in Canada. The interactive part of it tends to be very emotionally engaging and sticks with people. There's both a physical format and a digital format of this exercise, each with their own strengths and weaknesses. I was always taught previously to see North America and South American nations as the children of European nations. After the blanket exercise, I really started to see from the other point of view, the North and South America as the remnants of the thriving world and nations that were here before colonialism. So which are we?
We are both!
And more. In order to see what North and South America really are, you have to see the history of how we got here from all perspectives. Those that were here first, those that came here, those that were brought as slaves, those that came as immigrants, the true identity of this region of the world has components from many different sides. Sadly, many of these sides have been left out of mainstream education. I grew up in Labrador, in a predominantly Inuit community. I had the benefit of learning a bit more about Indigenous people in school than a lot of Canadians, but the core subjects, the core curriculum that was forced upon us by the school board, the powers that be higher up, was still predominantly from the colonial perspective. In addition to erasure of Indigenous people and other minorities in the history and social studies curriculum, the traditional colonialized education focuses on the scientific achievements of only people of European descent. Up until I was in grade 7, the Christianity was taught as if it was factual and the only valid religious belief system. And literature taught in school has historically been only literature written by Europeans or in post-colonial North America. Hey, Trickster. You know my professor, Sylvia Moore, the author of Trickster Chases the Tale of Education?
Yes, of course I do. I'm in that book.
Indeed you are. Now remind me about the high school history curriculum in Nova Scotia. Certainly, they have 3 options to fulfill the history requirement: Canadian history, Mi'kmaq studies, and African Canadian studies. When Mi'kmaq studies began being offered at the school Sylvia taught at, she had trouble breaking the perception people had that it was somehow an easy alternative to Canadian history. Then another year, she combined elements of Mi'kmaq studies with the Canadian history course, and students complained, thinking that Mi'kmaq studies shouldn't be a part of Canadian history. That dichotomy the powers that be created bothers me to no end. The fact that they make Mi'kmaq studies and African Canadian studies alternatives to Canadian history, as if they're not a part of Canadian history, and that students didn't think Mi'kmaq history is a part of Canadian history. If you're going to call a course Canadian history, it should have all sides of Canadian history: indigenous history, black history, all the other sides of it. If it's just going to be about the European descent Canadians, call it Euro-Canadian history or something. So, to answer questions about how to incorporate indigenous learning into education, I'd be interested to know about the type of curriculum indigenous people all had before colonialism. School, you think they had? Not necessarily in the formalized way we have it now, but they had a collection of knowledge that they passed on between the generations. Knowledge, you say? Knowledge the only part of curriculum, is it? Well, curriculum also teaches skills as well as knowledge. Teaches you to analyze and evaluate and create. It's not just knowledge, it's ways of knowing. Even the most primitive of societies have their own collections of knowledge and ways of knowing. Oh, primitive, you say? Think indigenous culture primitive, do you? Oh, I didn't mean to imply that. But thinking it you were. Alright, I'm ashamed to say it, but I do have a bit of a ingrained association between some pre-colonial societies and primacy. I know that I shouldn't, but it's kind of ingrained in there by the stories told by education and pop culture, and it's something that needs to change. Associate igloos as primitive, you do? But like to see you build one, I would. You're right. I would not know how to build an igloo without an expert supervising me. Igloos take a lot of work, and ancient Inuit people had to figure out how to do it without the benefit of the science textbooks we have now. They had to figure out how thermodynamics worked so that heat rises in the igloo. They had to figure out the architecture to build it so that it doesn't cave in. It's actually very impressive. A society that figured out how to build an igloo could not be called primitive by any stretch of the imagination. Very good. In order to decolonize our minds and get rid of prejudices, we must first acknowledge those prejudices are there. This chart shows roughly how I mentally organize curriculum in the current K-12 school system. Within each subject shown here is further divided into other subjects, but this is essentially the framework, a box with more boxes inside it, divided into a bunch of different categories. So, to incorporate indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing, we can put some content into each of these subjects. We can put the science of igloo building into the science and physics. We can put indigenous ways of governance into social studies and civics. We can put ice safety into the health curriculum. We can put indigenous stories and folklore into the language arts curriculum. Put indigenous spirituality into the religious and spirituality studies curriculum. Congratulations! You have put a round peg into a square hole. Oh, what do you mean? Well, indigenous education has elements that are round. We like circles, sharing circles, medicine wheels, not this square riggedness. Do you know what happens when you put a round peg into a square hole? Well, I mean, it partly depends on the size and the materials. Sometimes the round peg, it breaks out the sides of the square hole. Sometimes the square hole deforms the round peg and squishes it. That's right, they distort each other. Don't distort indigenous curriculum by forcing it into a square hole. But the square hole here, it's all I know. I don't know where else to put indigenous learning. You have a degree in religious studies, correct? Why, yes. And is the way you organized religious studies in this graph the only way you could have done it? Well, no, there are other ways to organize the information. I could have organized it by different religion, for instance. So you have other schemata you can use. Are all of your schemata this square and rigged? Well, actually, I have a presentation I do sometimes where I show how I think of language arts curriculum in the form of a rainbow. So you are capable of making other shapes to fit your curriculum in, then? Well, yeah, I suppose I can. Remember how we talked about how education has other components besides knowledge? Knowledge is the peg. You must use other things to create the whole. So I found this passage in my research on page 106 of Trickster Chases the Tale of Education. Life happens in a circle. We keep learning. There is no end, says Crow. You've told the stories of the learning circle and the inside-out circle. There is an outer circle and circles outside of the outer circles and circles outside of those circles. The cosmos is infinite. The circles are like the layers of a sphere, connected through a relationship. That which is in the circle of infinity is also in the circle within you. When you strengthen those connections and honor others in the circle, you accept responsibility for keeping the circle strong. When you acknowledge all life in the sacred web, you are in a relationship. That's where the knowledge is, in those relationships, and it is the knowledge that nourishes the human potential of all people. That gives me an idea for an alternative schema of education. Education can be thought of as a multi-layered circle or sphere with layers on top of each other. I've made this chart placing in the middle of the circle personal, moral, and spiritual development. Then the next layer just outside that circle is language and communication. Then there's a layer over that that can be relationships to land, people, and society. And then the next layer can be practical skills. And then the next layer can be artistic expression and legends and folklore. And then the outermost layer can be innovation and discovery. It's still not complete. I'm still open to adding and changing things. For instance, I haven't decided where traditional medicine would go in the circle schema. But it is an interesting way I can now look at education through a less colonized lens. The whole thing is, when I compare this with standards such as Gardner's theory of intelligences and the essential graduation learnings in my province, it holds up. All of the things mentioned in those schemata fit somewhere in here too. So by multiple standards, this schema works well. Oh, will this now replace your square and rigged schema? Not replace, supplement. In her book, Moore tells of a parable of a wolf who obtains a mouse eye and a buffalo eye. This metaphor of two separate eyes is used to imagine an education system that encourages two-eyed seeing. One eye to see indigenous ways of knowing, and one eye to see the westernized ways of knowing. What of assessment strategies? The NCCIU website for the National Center for Collaboration of Indigenous Education includes many resources for indigenizing and decolonizing education, including lesson plans, and they go for various subjects. Some of the subjects are the ones that I am used to associating with education, and some are more unique subjects that are just as important when it comes to decolonizing. These lesson plans do a good job of synthesizing the both indigenous and the colonized ways of doing things, and they use assessment strategies, some of which are ones that we don't usually think of in the colonized setting, such as sharing circles and reflections. And they also emphasize on the site helping students develop on 4 levels: physical, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual. Some of the indigenous ways of educating are things that I think the education system is working towards anyway, and should be, such as learning through narratives, learning to actually understand what is being taught rather than just learning straight up knowledge, and learning in relation to the local places and the environment and the land that we need to learn how to preserve for future generations. For me, decolonizing the mind and the education system is about recognizing that the stories I've been told for most of my life through school and through pop culture have been told through a colonial filter, and that they've distorted reality and overlooked the voices of indigenous people and people from other cultures. Decolonizing the mind is about removing that colonized filter and letting in the stories and the voices of indigenous people and people from other overlooked cultures, to hear the stories from their perspective and to include everybody's ways of doing things into education.